Good morning, brothers and sisters. We're going to start our Sunday school lesson. Since I don't have a dry erase board, this is my dry erase board. I want you to read this. Hopefully you can. I had to write it backwards so it would show up right for you. I want you to think about what comes to mind when you see this. God to the rescue. Okay, there are times when we are keenly aware that God has come to our rescue. And there are many other times when He has come to our rescue and we didn't know it. So, excuse me, we should not live in fear. Okay, you have to understand what I'm saying there. Because as long as we are living for God, we can be sure that He will continue to come to our rescue again and again. I don't want you to think that when I say that we shouldn't live in fear, it's because nothing is going to come upon us. Because indeed it will. However, we have to be able to take comfort in the fact that He is right there beside us. Oftentimes, He's ahead of us fighting the battles so that we don't even know what was coming our way. With that, we're going to be in the Old Testament. We're going to use a story from the Bible to teach this, of course. I want you to turn to the book of 2 Kings, chapter 18. The first reading will be verses 17 through 25. You know, the ancient Assyrian Empire endured from 1860 to 607 BC. And then it was absorbed into the Babylonian Empire. Sennacherib reigned from 705 to 681 BC. And he was the seventh and the most famous of the 10 kings of the Assyrian Empire. You know, it is told in 2 Kings, what we just read, that Sennacherib, his intent on adding the kingdom of Judah to his empire, set up his military headquarters in the Philistine border town of Lachish, which is in central Judah. And from there, he planned to direct his siege of Jerusalem. You know, his massive army, which by far outnumbered the army of Judah, was very intimidating. And King Hezekiah did not have a desire to engage in battle with such a superior force. You know, to avoid war, Hezekiah agreed to pay whatever ransom that Sennacherib had demanded of him. And that actual ransom was 300 talents or 11 tons of silver and 30 talents of gold, which is 1 ton. You know, Hezekiah had to strip the gold from the doors of the temple just to meet this demand. However, after receiving the ransom, Sennacherib refused to honor it. And it sent his field commander, which is Rabshakeh, along with 2 other officers, to demand of Hezekiah the complete surrender of Judah. You know, the 3 Assyrian officers approached Jerusalem with a large army, which was intended to intimidate Hezekiah. The location, which was described in verse 17, was the fuller's or the washer's field. And they stood by the upper pool near the wall of Jerusalem. You know, this was a very public location meant for Judah's officials and people of Judah to hear Sennacherib's threats. Here Hezekiah did not personally appear, but he sent 3 of his officials to negotiate it, as it says in verse 18. Rabshakeh, which was Sennacherib's spokesman, repeated the king's message to Judah's officials. The message was meant to impress Hezekiah with the power of Assyria, and that any hope of withstanding their might would be futile. Any attempt to oppose Syria through the alliance with Egypt was called vain. The Assyrians falsely accused Hezekiah of tearing down shrines to Yahweh. And this was the God of Israel. And therefore the people of Judah could not trust Yahweh to help them. So when in fact Hezekiah had torn down shrines to false gods, not to Yahweh. Mocking Hezekiah, the Rabshakeh offered to supply Judah with 2,000 horses, but only if Hezekiah could supply the cavalry to ride on them, knowing that he could not. Judah's army was no match for the sheer Assyrian multitude that had come against them. So finally, the Rabshakeh claimed that Yahweh had sent the Assyrians to destroy Judah, implying that Judah's God had turned against them and was now on the side of their enemies. All right, we're going to stop once again. We're going to read 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 33, 34, and 35. The Rabshakeh concluded his speech by comparing the God of Judah with the gods of other nations in verse 33. The Assyrians believed that when they conquered a nation, that they also conquered that nation's gods. So they ignorantly placed the one and only true living God of the Jews alongside of non-existent gods of other nations. It was true, as the Rabshakeh said, that none of the gods of the other nations had delivered them from being conquered by Assyria. He said that in verse 34. But he did here. He failed to realize that the God of the Jews could not be put in the same category as the false gods of all the other nations. Very unwisely, the Rabshakeh concluded that there was no possibility that Yahweh, the God of the Jews, would be able to save Jerusalem from the Assyrians, seeing that no other gods had been able to stop the conquest of his Assyrian military. As Sennacherib's spokesman, the Rabshakeh was speaking for his king, and therefore his words of blasphemy against the God of the Jews were also considered the words of Sennacherib. This is the reason why when the prophet Isaiah prophesied the defeat of Sennacherib by the God of the Jews, this was the charge against him. It said, "Whom hast thou reproached and blasphemed, and against hast thou exalted thy voice, and lifted up thine eyes on high, even against the Holy One of Israel? By thy messengers thou hast reproached the Lord." That's 2 Kings 19, 23 through 22 and 23. King Sennacherib was fully responsible to God for the messengers he sent to blaspheme the God of the Jews in an attempt to bully them into submission. All right, we're going to move on to 2 Kings chapter 19, read verses 1 and 2. After the Assyrian commanders' threatening and blasphemous speech, the officials and people remained silent. King Hezekiah had directed them not to answer. So when the Assyrian delegation departed, the king's 3 officials at that time rent their clothes in great distress, as it says. And they went to King Hezekiah and reported to him all that was said. Hearing the report from his officials, King Hezekiah rose up and tore his clothes, rent his clothes, and draped himself in sackcloth, which was coarse goat hair. That was clothing to be indicative of distress, of mourning, or of humiliation. Hezekiah and his officials, being devout men of God, rent their clothes and covered themselves in this sackcloth, and then and only then did Hezekiah enter the temple to pray. From the temple, Hezekiah sent his representatives and the leading priests to the prophet Isaiah, who lived in Jerusalem. It was Hezekiah's intention that while he was bringing this grave matter before the Lord in prayer, that he would also have the intercession of the prophet Isaiah on behalf of his country Judah. His hope was that Isaiah would receive a message from the Lord regarding the threat of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. All right, we're going to pause again. 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 3 and 4. Here Hezekiah's representatives came to Isaiah and communicated to him all that they had been said. They said that this was a day of trouble, if you will, for Judah, a day of adversity, anguish, a day of affliction and distress. They also said it was a day of rebuke, implying that this was divine chastisement for their sins. Finally, they said it was a day of blasphemy, because the God of Judah was misrepresented and scorned by the lies of the Assyrians about what their God was able to do for them. Judah was faced with either surrendering and accepting the subjection to the Assyrians, or they would be delivered from the Assyrians by their God. The officials sent to Isaiah likened Judah's dilemma to a pregnant woman who comes to the point of delivery, but does not have the strength to give birth. Unless God intervened on behalf of Judah, they considered themselves without hope. Hezekiah and his nation needed desperately to hear from God, and they were counting on that word from God to come through the prophet Isaiah. And Hezekiah's request for Isaiah to pray was summed up with these words. He said, "Wherefore lift up thy prayer for the remnant that are left," in verse 4. With the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, and the fortress cities of Judah having been taken by the Assyrians, there was only a remnant of Jews left in Jerusalem. Excuse me. All right. 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 5 through 7. In these verses, Isaiah gave God's answer to Hezekiah's representatives. The words of the Lord were most encouraging here, saying, "Be not afraid," in verse 6. It meant to be not afraid of the empty threats of the Assyrian king, that the Lord had indeed heard everything that Rabshakeh had said. They were extremely irreverent and blasphemous words intended to reproach the living God. and God would hold him accountable. God assured Hezekiah that he would turn Sennacherib's evil against him and would strike fear in his own heart beyond the fear the Jews experienced by his threatening. God said that he would send a blast like a violent wind against Sennacherib and, in effect, blow away the Assyrians. God would cause Sennacherib to return home upon hearing a threatening report, and there he would be killed. All right, one more reading, and we'll end with this. 2 Kings 19, verses 35 through 37. Here, through Isaiah, the Lord assured Hezekiah that Sennacherib's army would not enter Jerusalem, nor would they shoot a single arrow against it, and that they would not lay siege to it. God would miraculously intervene before any of these could be taken. Now you think about what we said in the beginning about not having fear, that at times God would be beside us, that all the times he would be with us, and even at times he would go before us, and that we would not even realize the steps he had taken on our behalf. Here it says God miraculously intervened before any of these steps could be taken. Furthermore, God assured Judah that King Sennacherib would return to his homeland by the same route that he came, which implies a hasty retreat. He was getting the heck out of Dodge. That very night, God sent his destroying angel to kill 185,000 soldiers of the Assyrian army. Many believe the army was stricken by an outbreak of maybe the pneumonic bubonic plague, which is highly contagious and fatal within 24 hours. Maybe this was the means of their death. I don't know. But God's destroying angel was the cause. And here, for all to see, was incontrovertible proof that it is very foolish to defy and to blaspheme the living God. What's our world doing today? What do they have in store for them? God fulfilled his word regarding King Sennacherib. He who had terrorized the king and the people of Judah with his threats awoke in terror at what God had done to his army. With haste and in shame, Sennacherib retreated back to Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria. It was there, after some years had passed, that the rest of God's word was indeed fulfilled. It tells us that while worshiping in the temple of his chief god, which was, I believe it's pronounced Nisroch, Sennacherib was assassinated by his own two sons. It is significant that this took place in the temple of Sennacherib's God, who once again could not protect him. God is always with us. God's destruction of the Assyrian army to save Jerusalem and Judah affirms that God has sovereign authority and power over events and people in this world. While the miraculous nature of God's destruction of the Assyrian army is clearly seen, the fact is that God is always working by his sovereign authority and power in events and through people to bring outcomes that He has willed to be. You know, the fact that we do not always clearly see or clearly understand what God is doing, we must not allow this to keep us from knowing that He is always, and what do we always say about all? Always, He is in all things, working for good to those who love Him and who are called according to His purpose. We all know that verse. It's Romans 8:28. We're going to end with that. Just know He's always there with you. He's always fighting. Times of trouble will come. There will be valleys, but there will also be mountaintops. I love y'all. Have a great day.